They had already accepted death. In the early hours before dawn, when the sky was still a deep shade of blue and the frost clung to the ground like a final reminder of winter, dozens of German women sat in silence. Their uniforms were worn. Their boots cracked. Their hands, trembling, held close to their bodies for warmth. They were prisoners now. Captured far from home. Their war was over. Their future, already decided in their minds. Some of them prayed. Their lips moved, but no sound came. Others wiped their faces with sleeves stiff from dried tears. A few just stared at the cold earth beneath their feet, as if trying to memorize it before they left the world. They believed that when the sun rose, they would be taken to a wall, or perhaps a field, and that would be the end of their story. There were no speeches among them. No arguments. No cries for mercy. Just the quiet acceptance of what they thought would come at first light. And as the horizon began to pale, as the first thin line of morning drew itself across the sky, every heart tightened. Every breath became still. They waited. And waited. For the moment they believed would take their lives. But when the British soldiers finally approached, what came next was something none of them had prepared themselves to understand. Dawn had not yet broken, but the cold was already awake. The winter air moved through the camp without concern for rank, uniform, or suffering. It stung the skin and settled deep into bone. The camp itself was little more than a cluster of tired wooden buildings and canvas tents, hastily arranged in a rural village scarred by recent fighting. Barn walls were splintered. Smoke stains clung to chimneys. The ground was hard and uneven, frozen in places where fires no longer burned. The German women had been brought here only a day earlier. Their uniforms, once pressed and neat, were marked by mud, ash, and long weeks of marching. The skin on their faces was pale from hunger and exposure. Their hair hung loose, tangled, flattened by snow and dried sweat. Many looked older than their age. Some were barely more than girls. They sat close to one another, backs against damaged walls, boots drawn to their chests. Some whispered quietly, as if sound itself might draw unwanted attention. Others stared outward, eyes unfocused, trapped somewhere between memory and dread. Their arrival had not come with explanations. No officer had told them what would happen next. No schedule was given. No reassurance was offered. And in the empty space where information should have been, rumors began to grow. One woman said the British had no place to hold them long. Another claimed captured women were sometimes shown no mercy. Someone else had heard stories from the Eastern Front, about how surrender did not always mean survival. The whispers moved through them quietly. We will be shot in the morning. They will not keep us alive. Why would they? And though no one could confirm the words, no one could deny them either. The camp guards did little to ease their fears. They spoke in short phrases, gave brief orders, and then returned to their posts. Their expressions were unreadable. Their silence left the women to fill the unknown with their own expectations. So the belief took hold, quietly, gradually, until it felt like certainty. The women were convinced that dawn would not only bring light. It would bring their end. But the question remains. Why did they believe they would be executed at sunrise? These women were not frontline fighters. They were not trained for battle, nor were they the ones who had drawn the plans or ordered the advance. Many had taken on roles that kept armies functioning in the background. Some had served as nurses, tending to the wounded with bandages that ran out long before the war did. Others had worked as field clerks, copying reports by lamplight while artillery boomed far away. There were radio operators who spent their days listening to static, waiting for messages that carried fear in every coded word. There were cooks who stretched rations as far as they could, dividing meals into smaller and smaller portions as supplies dwindled. A number of them had been no more than 18 years old when they were assigned their stations. Young women, caught between duty and survival, swept into a war they did not begin and could not control. And yet, the uniform they wore changed how the world saw them. It did not matter if they had carried rifles or not. It did not matter if they had ever harmed anyone. It did not matter what they hoped for, prayed for, or wanted their lives to be. They had surrendered. And surrender carried its own weight. In their minds, surrender meant shame. And shame, in war, was often followed by punishment. Some of the women wept quietly, shielding their faces with their hands so the others wouldn't see. A few whispered old hymns under their breath, melodies they remembered from childhood, sung now as a final act of holding on to something familiar. But most did nothing at all. They sat in stillness, staring ahead, as though their futures had already closed. Their shoulders lowered. Their bodies tired. Their thoughts silent. They were waiting for the end they believed was coming. Waiting because there was nothing else left to do. But among them, there was one woman who did not bow her head. She did not pray. She did not cry. She kept her eyes open. She refused to break. Her name was Anna. She was 22 years old. Before the war, she had been a schoolteacher in a small town. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Where mornings began with the sound of children gathering in a courtyard, and evenings ended with the smell of bread cooling on windowsills. She had once carried chalk and lesson plans. Now she carried the weight of uniform cloth that never truly felt like it belonged to her. Her hands had always trembled, even before all of this. A small shake that grew worse when she was cold, or frightened, or tired. In this camp, her hands shook constantly. There was no way to still them. She sat with the others, but her eyes moved differently. She looked at everything, the guard towers, the rifles stacked near the tent entrance, the pale line of the horizon where dawn would soon arrive. She knew what the others believed. She felt it pressing in on her from every side. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small piece of paper. It had been folded and unfolded many times, softened by touch. On her knee, she began to write, slowly, carefully, her hand quivering so much that the pencil left faint, uneven lines. She wrote to her mother. Not about the war. Not about what she feared was coming. She wrote about the things that still lived quietly in her memory. The apple tree behind their house. The sound of rain on the tin roof. The smell of laundry drying in the kitchen warmth. The way the church bells sounded on Sundays. She stopped often to steady her hand. Not because the words were difficult. But because she didn't expect to write again. Beside her sat another young woman, no older than 19. The girl's face was blotched from crying. Anna leaned toward her, her voice barely above a breath. "I don't want to die here," she whispered. "Not like this." The girl did not answer. She simply lowered her head and listened. Around them, the camp remained still. The guards spoke in quiet tones far from the prisoners. The sky continued its slow climb toward morning. Every small sound seemed louder than it should have been. Footsteps, wind moving through broken boards, the faint clink of cups from a distant fire. Anna folded the letter and held it against her chest. There was nothing she could do now. Nothing any of them could do. The belief sat heavy among them. That mercy was something distant. Meant for other places, other people, other times. And yet, was there a chance, anywhere in that cold morning, that someone would show them compassion? Or was the rising sun only bringing the end they feared? The night deepened, and the cold grew heavier. It did not come suddenly. It settled gradually, the way winter does when it has no reason to stop. The women pulled their coats tighter, trying to hold in whatever warmth their bodies had left. The ground beneath them felt like iron. Every movement sent a thin ache through their legs and backs, as though their bones were turning brittle from the cold itself. The British guards stood a short distance away. They did not taunt, threaten, or make a display of authority. They simply watched. Quiet. Still. Controlled. And in that silence, the women found their answer. No words were spoken, but silence can deliver its own message. The women believed the guards were waiting for dawn. Waiting for the time when orders would be carried out. Waiting for the moment when movement would replace stillness, and finality would replace uncertainty. So the prisoners prepared themselves in the only ways they could. One woman covered her face with her hands and whispered the same prayer over and over. She did not ask for life. She asked for the strength to face whatever came. Another tried to sleep, though sleep came only in short breaths. Her cheeks were still wet from crying, but exhaustion finally overcame her fear, if only for moments at a time. A few leaned against one another, sharing whatever warmth human closeness could offer. They did not speak. Their breathing fell into the same slow rhythm. And then there was Anna. She did not close her eyes. She sat upright, her back against the wall of the wooden barrack, her letter still folded in her hands. She looked toward the sky, not for hope, not for escape, but simply because she wanted to see the night one last time if this was to be the end. The stars were faint behind thin clouds. A single line of smoke rose from a guard's pipe near the perimeter fence. The camp dog shifted in its sleep, paws twitching against the frozen ground. These were the small, ordinary things that still belonged to the world. Time moved slowly. The guards shifted their stance now and then, but they did not speak. The women breathed, slept, or prayed, waiting for something they could not stop. The night stretched on, and with it came a stillness that left no place to hide from thought. And then, very gradually, the darkness began to thin. The first faint trace of morning appeared along the edge of the sky. Dawn was coming. The sky continued to lighten, shifting from deep blue to a pale gray. The frost on the ground began to glisten faintly, catching the first suggestion of dawn. A thin mist clung to the earth, moving slowly in the early morning air. The women noticed the change in the light. Every breath seemed heavier now. Every heartbeat more deliberate. They pushed themselves upright, some with effort, some with trembling arms. No one spoke. The only sounds were quiet breaths, the distant rustle of canvas on the tents, and the slow, steady shifting of boots on gravel from the guard line. Then, footsteps approached. A British officer walked toward them. He did not hurry. His pace was measured, his eyes forward, his hands clasped behind his back. With each step, the gravel under his boots cracked sharply in the cold air. The women watched him draw nearer, and the belief they had carried through the night reached its height. One woman's legs gave out beneath her. She sank to the ground, her hands covering her face, her breath breaking unevenly. No one tried to lift her. They were all holding themselves steady in the only ways they could. The officer stopped a few paces from them. No expression on his face. No change in posture. No indication of what his orders would be. The air felt still. Anna's hands tightened around the letter in her grasp. Her shoulders lifted slightly as she drew in a breath and waited. The officer spoke. His voice was calm. Plain. Direct. Stand, he said. A moment of silence. Not for execution. Another pause. For breakfast. The words hung there in the cold morning air. Not rushed. Not emphasized. Spoken simply, as if they were the most ordinary instructions in the world. But the women did not react. Not yet. They remained still. Frozen between the world they had been preparing to leave. And the one they were suddenly being returned to. The meaning of the words had been spoken. But the understanding had not reached them yet. At first, no one moved. The officer's words still hung in the cold morning air, and the women remained where they were, unsure if they had heard correctly, unsure if acting on hope might break whatever fragile reality had settled over them. Then a second voice called out from beside the cook tent. Calm. Steady. Come forward. Slowly. The women lifted their heads. The British soldiers were arranged quietly, neither smiling nor stern. Their rifles were at rest, pointed down, straps loose, posture unthreatening. A table had been set. Tin cups glinted faintly in the early light. Steam rose from them in thin, wavering threads. The scent reached the women before they took a single step. Warm broth, gentle and familiar, something that reminded them of kitchens and mornings before the world changed. Some of the women took a hesitant step forward. Others remained still, unable to trust their own bodies to move. When they finally approached, the details became clear. Bread, not the hard, dry crusts of camp rations, but soft bread that tore easily when touched. Butter, pale and real, melting slowly against the warmth of the loaf. Soup ladled into cups, thick, fragrant, rising into the cold air like a quiet invitation. The women reached out. Their fingers shook. One woman pressed the cup to her lips but did not drink. She stared at it, eyes unfocused, as though she needed time to remember how to eat without fear. Another sank to her knees and wept, the tears falling silently at first, then with sound. Not sobbing for hunger, but for release. For the first time in months, her body understood it was allowed to continue living. A few whispered apologies under their breath, apologies to no one and everyone. I thought it was the end. I thought I would never go home. Some simply looked forward, unblinking, the steam from their cups rising gently across their faces. No one rushed them. No orders. No raised voices. Only quiet. A British sergeant stepped forward, his hands unarmed, his voice steady and grounded. He looked at them not as prisoners, not as enemies, but as human beings who had endured more than words could hold. The war is over, he said softly. Not here. Not today. The words settled over them like a blanket laid across shaking shoulders. And there, in the cold morning light, where they had once braced themselves for death, they were given something else instead. Mercy. Quiet. Steady. Real. Not because anyone demanded it, but because someone chose it. And in that choice, the story changed. The women lived. They rose from the makeshift breakfast table, some still trembling, some unable to move for a moment longer. They were exhausted, cold, and weary. But they were alive. In the days that followed, they would walk through the camp again, their steps quieter now, their bodies carrying a different understanding of what had occurred. Many would remember the morning forever. A memory that would not fade, because it was carved not in violence or loss, but in the smallest and most persistent form of kindness. Some would write it down later, in journals that they kept for decades. One entry would say simply, I expected death. I was given dignity. Another would note the warmth of the soup. Another, the smell of fresh bread. Another, the sound of a voice that spoke calm words in a moment when words had seemed impossible. And they carried these details with them, not as triumphs, not as proof of heroism, but as evidence that even in a world designed to punish, it was possible for human beings to show restraint, patience, and care. In war, cruelty is easy. Decisions can be made in anger. Orders can be followed without thought. Hatred can move swiftly. But mercy, true mercy, requires something different. It requires awareness. It requires choice. It requires courage. And on that cold morning, in a quiet corner of a rural camp, courage chose to rise instead of cruelty. The women left the camp with their lives intact. Their bodies carried the marks of war, their hearts carried the memory of fear. But within them, something had survived the way no uniform or surrender could take away. The knowledge that even in the darkest hours, kindness could still exist. And now, as the memory of that morning settles in, if you were a British soldier standing there, watching them, would you have done the same?